All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving into something that I have a feeling has been on your mind because you, our listeners, have shared some really interesting stuff on it. And that is this question of how deeply are we really able to read in this day and age with just constant digital information coming at us?
Yeah.
You specifically pointed us to a really cool YouTube video, and it's from the Lady of the Library channel, and it's called, Are We Still Capable of Deep Reading? So that is our jumping off point for this deep dive, really just trying to understand, what are some of the concerns around deep reading in our current environment, and then what are some potential ways forward that maybe this video suggests?
Yeah, it's such an important question and one that I think a lot of us are wrestling with, right? I mean, you might have noticed even in your own life kind of a shift in your reading habits, maybe finding it a little harder to really get lost in a longer piece of writing. And the video starts out by saying, yeah, you are not alone in that way.
Totally, yeah. It starts by talking about how some university professors are even noticing a real decline in their students' ability to kind of do that sustained reading, like even compared to just a decade ago. Mm-hmm. And then the speaker in the video, reflects on their own experience, saying, back when they were in their master's program, reading multiple dense books in a week, like even tackling something like Ulysses, by James Joyce, felt totally doable. And now, even just getting through a monthly book club selection can sometimes feel like a huge task.
Right. And so from there, what I thought was so interesting was how the video goes on to define what we're even talking about when we say deep reading, right? So they use this definition from Sven Berkertz from his book, The Gutenberg Elegies, which came out back in 1994. And he defines it as the slow and meditative possession of a book. And he says, we don't just read the words, we dream our lives in their vicinity, which I love. So, it's not just about taking in information, but like letting it really land and connect with our own internal world, which feels like, that's getting rarer and rarer, right? Yeah. And that really sets up this contrast with what we do so much of these days, which is skim reading.
For sure. And so the video makes this point that, this shift towards skim reading has almost become like an evolutionary response, like the way our brains are kind of adapting to just the overwhelming amount of information that's constantly coming at us every single day, right?
Right.
Think about, all the headlines, articles just flashing across our screens, comments on social media, emails that are always pinging us, text messages that are demanding our attention. And the video even says, think about it, multiple texts every few hours, plus the just relentless flow of emails. It's almost like mind-boggling when you really stop to think about it.
It is.
And so, while our brains are really good at adapting to that, we do kind of risk, sacrificing that more nuanced comprehension, the deeper understanding for this kind of rapid, surface level scanning.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that leads to one of the core arguments that's out there about how the internet is changing our brains. And this is something that Nicholas Carr really explores in his book, The Shallows. And he even talks about it, anecdotally. He's like, I feel like something's been tinkering with my brain, reprogramming the memory. He had this growing difficulty immersing himself in longer text, kind of always feeling this pull toward distraction.
Right. And the video does a really nice job of kind of explaining this central thesis that Carr is putting forward, which is, by kind of offloading all these, cognitive tasks to computers into the internet, we're essentially weakening our ability to do that sustained linear kind of thinking, which is the exact kind of thinking that deep reading requires, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And instead, our brains start to mirror the way that we interact with technology. So it's like these shorter bursts of attention and just constantly kind of flitting between things, kind of like how we click through tabs on a browser and just always kind of scanning for the next piece of information.
Mm-hmm. And you see it, like the video says, you see that playing out in real life too. Right. I mean, how many times, right, do you see people, on their phones while they're walking down the street, or even worse, while they're driving, or, out to dinner with someone, and they're just constantly checking, Yeah. It's become so commonplace that, we hardly even notice it anymore, but it really does underscore how much we've kind of developed this habit of fragmented attention.
It's true. And it makes me think, too, about how even some of the changes that we tend to think of as being, for the better, like the move towards online academic texts, right? The video makes this point, even that can pose its own challenges to deep reading. Mm-hmm. And so while it's great because it increases accessibility, there's also this, ease of switching between tabs and the sense that there are always endless linked resources right there at your fingertips. And so it can really create this feeling of being so overwhelmed. Like the speaker talks about their brain screaming with fury when they're trying to, have the reading tab and the writing tab open and just going back and forth. And I feel like so many of us who have tried to do any sort of, serious research online have probably had that feeling.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And it's so interesting, to think about the implications of that on how we even measure good reading now. And the video talks about this a little bit too, how platforms like Goodreads, which are great, they're designed to encourage reading, right? But they can also kind of shift the focus from the quality of our engagement with the text to just like how many books we've read.
Right, exactly, yeah. And that anecdote that they share in the video about those people who they enjoy the books, but then afterwards they can't remember, any major plot points. They can't remember key characters or even like the title of the book. It really does make you stop and think, like, are we really, absorbing and processing what we read, or are we just kind of, passively consuming?
Yeah, totally. And that really gets at, how crucial focused attention is to the whole acting. The video talks about focused attention, meditation, and even like how that can affect our anterior cingulate cortex, part of the brain that's involved in critical analysis and error detection. So, that part of our brain is really important for being able to focus our attention, to analyze complex arguments, to really notice the nuance and the subtleties of what we're reading, and then to really deeply understand it. And the suggestion is that, maybe the constant distractions of the internet age are actually like negatively impacting how that part of the brain functions.
Yeah. And so now this is where I think it gets really interesting and really helpful, because the video doesn't just leave us with, all the problems, right? But it actually offers some really concrete strategies for how we can kind of retrain our brains. Mm-hmm. So let's get into those. The first one that they talk about is this practice of pre-reading meditation. And it doesn't have to be, anything super formal or lengthy. They talk about just taking 6 seconds to inhale deeply and 6 seconds to exhale before you even, open that email or that article or even just a text message, right? And it's just about kind of creating that little moment of stillness before you sort of plunge back into the digital noise.
Yeah. I love that. It's about being intentional, right? Like, how am I going to approach this?
Exactly.
How am I going to, prepare my mind to receive this information? And then the next thing, the video talks about minimizing distractions. And they really stress the importance of starting out in complete silence. And even things that we think of as being conducive to focus, like, certain types of music or ambient sounds, they say actually in the beginning, those might actually hinder the process because, that discomfort of silence can be kind of a sign of how much we need it.
Oh, that's such a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
And for those of us who are, doing academic work or any kind of really like in-depth reading online, that advice to limit the number of tabs that we have open to just 2, the text that you're reading and the document that you're writing in, and then like close your email, put your phone away. It almost feels like this, rebellious act in our culture of multitasking.
Oh, totally.
And then they have this very practical tip, which is like use a spreadsheet to organize multiple resources and only open the links when you absolutely have to kind of prevent that feeling of just being overwhelmed by, an ocean of tabs.
Yeah. And then there's also, embracing pen and paper, going back old school and taking notes by hand. And the speaker talks about how they actually find themselves being more productive this way.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they need to take fewer breaks compared to when they're typing notes. So it really does encourage a different kind of engagement, a more active way of being with the material.
Totally, yeah. And then it's not just about those, external distractions, but also, what about those feelings of just mental overwhelm that we get. And so the video recommends, really acknowledging those feelings, like even writing them down on a notebook as a way to sort of externalize that sense of being overstimulated and maybe kind of get a little perspective on it. Then they talk about the Pomodoro technique, the idea of like 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, which I love. Or they talk about kind of a variation of that, which is the 50-10 method, 50 minutes of focused reading and then 10 minutes off. But just the idea of these dedicated blocks of, focused reading interspersed with, shorter breaks can help to really maintain concentration without hitting that wall of, mental fatigue. And then so important, the breaks should be truly non-digital, like actually getting up, making some tea or stretching or playing with a pet, anything that doesn't involve staring at another screen.
Yeah, I love that. Like actually giving your brain a break from the constant input.
Yes, exactly. And so finally, they end on this really beautiful note with this quote from Marcel Proust. And it's all about the essence of reading. So Proust says, reading, unlike conversation, consists for each of us in receiving the communication of another thought while remaining alone, while continuing to bring into play the mental powers we have in solitude. And I thought that was so powerful because, it makes me think about how much emphasis we put these days on like documenting our reading experiences, right? Like taking pictures of books in these, beautifully curated settings instead of really just engaging in the act of reading itself, which is, fundamentally, solitary and reflective.
Totally. It's about that inner experience, not how it looks to the outside world.
Exactly.
Right. It's about that connection you're making with the text, all on your own.
Yeah. Yeah, so bringing it all together, this deep dive into the Lady of the Library video, I think really just highlights, how we are up against these very real challenges to preserving our ability to do deep reading in this world of, constant connection and digital input.
Yeah. But, one thing I appreciate about the video is that it also offers this feeling of possibility, right? It suggests that deep reading isn't necessarily lost, but maybe it's, just kind of dormant. And with a little bit of effort and conscious attention, we can kind of retrain ourselves and, reawaken that part of our brains. I know for me, I used to think that multitasking was the ultimate productivity hack.
Totally.
But by forcing myself to do these blocks of focused reading, it's actually helped me feel way less overwhelmed and more engaged with what I'm reading.
That's so interesting. And on that note, I think a final provocation for you, our listener, really inspired by how the video leaves us, is to think about, just one of the practical strategies that we talked about today, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe it's those 6 seconds of focused breathing before you open your next email. Or maybe it's setting a timer for a dedicated block of reading time. Right. But just think about, how might even that one small change start to shift your own experience with, reading and consuming information. And maybe even more profoundly, what mental powers in solitude, Cruz so beautifully put it, might you begin to rediscover.
Just a good.
So until next time, happy reading, everyone.